people can very easily tune out if the communications is missing, or there's a gap to it, or there's an emotional response to it, because of that danger in the reaction. So we have to put communications first and foremost and do it often, little and often, precise, specific, so that we can make sure that we covered that off.
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Ricky.
Hi, I'm Rob.
Hello, everybody. And today is the first part of a 4-part series where we delve into communications. And today, the question is, why do we keep getting communication so wrong?
Well, that's a nice big question for the first part of a 4-parter. So, no, brilliant. I mean, and the temptation here is that we could be here for hours because there are so many different examples, I'm sure. But, let's just look at a few of them. I mean, almost all companies that we work with, Ricky, cite communication as a significant issue for their business. And yet, we have conversations with people about, okay, so that's an issue. So who have you told about that then? And we get that slightly disappointing answer back. Well, no one. Almost as if it's everybody else's problem or everybody else's fault, and it's nothing that I can do about it, nothing that is to do with me as an individual.
And I just love the irony in that. I think that's just, our communication's terrible. Okay, so what are you doing about it? Oh no, it's the business's responsibility. And you go, hang on a minute. And that's probably why, that statistic we found recently where only 35% of people believe organizations communicate effectively. And that we found that, I think, in Forbes earlier this year in March. And you go, okay, so let's flip that. That means 65% of people think it's not good enough, or certainly probably worse in some parts.
Yeah, I mean, it's an astonishing statistic. In one way, not surprising because we hear this so often. But when you look at it from that point of view, to go, wow, that's a huge number, isn't it? So, let's have a look at some of the things that we've come across, or pick a few of what I think would be a myriad of examples.
Because our podcasts aren't that long, Rob. So
and we like to be specific, don't we? And actually, the first thing to talk about is not specific, but it's about general. So I think most companies have the right intent about communications, in the fact that everybody should have the same message. We should try and give it in a timely fashion, and we will give a general communication out so that everybody knows.
How do they do that sort of thing where they've got to give these kind of global communications? What do they use?
It's a sort of COVID helped everybody to a degree in terms of getting far more au fait with online communications and Teams calls and Zoom calls, etc. So the theory behind all of this is that actually we can communicate what's happening in the company to everybody at the same time using different platforms, whether that's an online version, or whether it's something called, well, the Americans call typically an all hands, where we're getting all of the key areas within the company communicated with simultaneously, so that, as I say, the theory is everybody knows. We're not.
These are like town halls, yeah?
Town halls, absolutely. That's another name for them. I mean, I remember probably 7 or 8 years ago now, standing in the foyer of Boots in Nottingham, where everybody was pulled together, everybody down tools. There was a communication from the then new CEO, and it was effective in its theory because we wanted everybody to have the same message, but totally ineffective in my mind because it was so general in nature that the interpretation of that communication was going to be received by however many thousand people were being talked to at the same time. So it could be interpreted in thousands of different ways.
And I suppose this is where the responsibility of the line manager is really important, to be able to go, okay, so this is what they've said.
Mm-hmm.
Let's work this through and understand what this means for us.
Exactly. Let's tailor those communications that we've heard, and let's think about what's relevant to us, what's meaningful to us. What does that mean then? What's the context behind it, and what should we do with that communication?
And I think that that's also important, to allow your team to challenge, to question, to be curious, and test for understanding for themselves as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say, as a sort of a starting point, the general communications is flawed because we don't really want it to just be general communications without it then being contextualized and taken further so that people can really get to grips with what was just said then and what did it just mean. And I think that would continue into feedback. We sometimes get the feedback wrong. Again, the intent is right because we want to give general feedback, but actually giving general feedback doesn't help because generic feedback to a group means that an individual who that feedback perhaps it should be aimed at is lost in the group. They go, well, that doesn't apply to me because it's just generic feedback, and we need to be very careful of that as well.
Well, and I think there's nothing more frustrating when people go, we've had this blanket email
Hmm.
that's telling us all that we need to either up our game or change a certain thing or do things differently. And actually they're going, it's because they don't have the bravery, the courage, or are not got the skills to have a conversation with an individual that says, "Oi, we need to stop this,
Yes.
and we need to do it differently." Instead, we tar everybody with that same brush. We bring everybody into the message, into the loop,
Yes.
because we go, well, if they're doing it, everybody's doing it. Well, that's not true.
No.
Actually, most people go, well, I'm doing what you ask. What's the issue? And
Yes.
like you said, it lands on deaf ears in the person that you want to hear it the most.
Yeah, true story. And even if the person who is, let's just call them the guilty party, thinks, oh, okay, well, that's fine. The group was addressed. I wasn't addressed, so I'm safe in my anonymity. Because the feedback has just been given generically.
And I think your point about feedback is really important because actually, if you tackle it with that individual, that gives them an opportunity
Mm,
to go, well, I didn't understand or I didn't
correct.
realize and absolutely I'll change then. Now you've told me,
Yes.
I'll happily change. Or actually, you know what? I didn't realize, but I could do with some help moving to that new way of doing things or changing the way I'm doing or stopping doing what you you no longer want me to do. So
Yes.
so I think that, often we think giving somebody feedback is going to lead to some sort of confrontation and rarely does it because people go, oh, that's really great, thank you for letting me know.
Yes. So I think the gist amongst all of this is we all have to communicate. There's a need for communication. There's different ways of communicating. But if we're going to just try to, I don't know, from a numbers game, say we've got to come out with a communication that everybody can have, think twice because that might not actually land the way you intended for it to land in the first place. So, general communications is probably something that you don't necessarily want to go down the route of.
Absolutely. Tell me about assumptions then, Rob, because I'm sure they're a big issue in communication.
Linked, I think, really to what we were just talking about. There are gaps in what is either communicated by somebody or even received by the person it's communicated to. And those gaps can only be filled by assumptions. It is an understood and well researched human sort of frailty, if you like, or human condition that actually, without all of the information, what we tend to do is we just make up stories. We fill in the blanks. So, the trouble with assumptions is that actually, if I'm a line manager of a group of people, I can make very easy assumptions that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and everybody gets it. And the last communication that I gave out, everybody understands and is now acting on. But how do I know that? That's not necessarily true because assumptions can get in the way of all of that. And we could miss crucial information, or the information that we're giving that we think might be crucial and given in such a way that people must understand it can completely be misinterpreted. So I'm in danger as a line manager again of assuming that the receiver of that information understands what's being asked of them, and unless I use some sort of feedback mechanism, then how can I test that understanding has landed?
And I got caught out with this as a young manager, and people would go, "Why are your people not doing this particular process?
Right.
And I go, I have no idea. I've told them till I'm blue in the face, and they just don't seem to be doing it. Well, you know, it's easy to blame
Mm.
the recipient when you think you've delivered the message.
Yeah.
But what I can't say is that I went and tested it and I went and questioned and challenged and looked for understanding, mine and theirs, to go, do you get why this is important? Do you
Yes.
get what this means? Do you get what this is, why it's important for the organization, why it's important for you, and how it therefore plays out in terms of the customer experience that we deliver? And I as a young manager, you don't always realize because nobody sits you down and tells you these things,
Yeah.
and you learn generally when there's a problem.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, closely aligned with assumptions, we've got another issue, another potential blocker or interference to communication, and that is the emotional context or the emotional response or reaction that we all have towards a communicated message. So, we will always react to a message received, typically emotionally, before we have the opportunity to rationalize things. We don't just take information at face value and go, okay, logic says I can rationalize this straight away. If especially if there's something that is given to us as a piece of information that we don't understand to begin with, or we don't understand the context, or we think is being aimed at us personally, emotions can very definitely get in the way. And I think assumptions and emotions go hand in hand with this because, you know, to the point I made before, if we've got a gap in some information and we make up the story, the rest of the information, try to fill the gap, typically we'll fill the gap with an emotional response. We'll go, oh, they must have said that because, oh, and somebody's having a go at me.
Well, you're an expert in change, and you've done lots of work around the world on change. And
Mm,
actually, when we first communicate change, that triggers an emotional
yep.
response because people are now they're either uncertain, unsure, they're fearful for their jobs, their well-being, their families. And actually, when you deliver that first message, the likelihood is they'll probably miss most of the message that you're saying,
Yep.
which means that actually communication isn't a one time gig either. If you
No.
want to help people, particularly in times of change, you've got to communicate little and often, and even more importantly, tell them when there's nothing to say.
Yes.
Because to your point, I'm going to fill in the blanks. I'm going to fill in the gaps with assumptions, and I will start to play that out in terms of, what that means for me, even though I'm probably operating on 20 or 30% of the facts because I tuned out because I started to imagine what this means for me.
Correct. Yeah. And I had a brilliant example of that being done well with a healthcare company that I worked with a number of years ago, where they put a communications plan together that had a frequency of every 2 weeks. And precisely to your point, that even if they came to a point at a certain communication timeline that now was the time to say something, and they didn't have anything to say, they still communicated and say, "Oh, by the way, guys, we said that we would communicate on this day. There hasn't been any progress on this. We're still working to what we said we're working to before, just so that you know." And they were absolutely brilliant at that because they understood, your point exactly, that people can very easily tune out if the communications is either missing, or there's a gap to it, or there's an emotional response to it, because of that danger in the reaction. So we have to put communications first and foremost and do it often, little and often, precise, specific, so that we can make sure that we covered that off.
Okay.
I think that probably brings us to another thing just to mention here, and I think we touched on it before, which is about ambiguity. Because sometimes, again, you will have the experience. I know I've got the experience of the fact that, you know, some information just leaves too much for the imagination. It's not specific enough, it's not clear enough. And so there's an opportunity for people to misinterpret precisely because there's a gap, there's ambiguity in it.
Well, I call this wriggle room. So
Okay.
if you give me some wriggle room, I am likely to take it, particularly if I feel like I'm not going to deliver on time, or to the required level or to the required standard, I will take that wriggle room and go, well, that's what I thought it was.
Yes.
And as the manager, you get really frustrated when people do that to you, and you go, "You know, but that's not what I asked for. That's not what I meant. That's not what I intended." And people will use their poetic license to create a solution or create a finished product that you imagined was looking like this, and actually it looks very, very different. And
Yes.
there's nothing more frustrating. So, you know, I always talk to managers, you've got to get really clear
Mm.
so that they know what's expected and you know what's expected. And if you are giving them poetic license, well, that's fine.
Yeah.
But at least they know that the outcome is on them and not on you in terms of, what they create is really the most important thing here.
Sure. Well, and maybe the thing to do is to sort of move forward then about, so how can we improve that? And just thinking about the point that you just raised, clarity. That's a good starting point.
I think you're onto something. And I think, quite often we're given all these mental models, all these tools to do it. And
Mm.
actually, we've probably got some of these tools already in our kit bag. I mean,
Just not using them.
no, exactly. And you go, you triggered a thought in my
Mm.
mind when you talked about clarity, and you go, well, surely smart can be used for this, right?
Right. Well, in my book, absolutely. I mean, we have, as an acronym, an ability to have a mental checklist to enable us to get communications better than they perhaps might be at the moment. So, how specific do we need to be? How specific can we be with a communication that we need or would like to put out? Can we put some sort of measure on that so that we allow people to understand that we're talking about this but not that? In other words, what's in scope? So we're contextualizing by thinking about the measure part of smart. We
Well,
actually can put a time frame to it, and we can talk about how relevant something is so that people can buy into the fact that actually the communication is meant for this purpose, it's meant for me, and I can now do something with it.
and I think arguably above all the things there, it's this purpose thing, it's this relevance. The
Right.
reason why,
Mm.
I'm not asking you for permission, I'm not asking for your approval,
Hmm.
but I'm explaining why we are doing this, changing this, moving from that, or whatever it might be. Um, and I think that helps context. It
Yes.
helps people to understand. It helps them to process, and it will also help them to formulate questions as well. And then, to back that up with those other elements of this about being specific, there's some quantifiable element to this,
Yes.
and certainly, going back to our change example, timely. So your example of your client that delivered fortnightly
Mm.
messages, I avoid bi-weekly because I'm never quite sure, is that twice a week or every 2 weeks?
Oh, there's a
But for
communication issue. Yeah. Mhm.
exactly,
Yes, it's open to
clarification,
interpretation. Yeah.
terminology,
Mm.
let's be really, really clear what we're doing, when we're doing it, and what makes this really important.
Well, how many times have we spoken to people, and I know it's in the context of goals and using SMART, and we've said, okay, so what's the timeline on it then? Oh, end of the month. Okay, hang on a second. You can be much clearer. What does end of the month actually mean? And a very quick realization comes through that if we're talking about the 31st or the 30th of the month, oh, it's fallen on a Sunday. Well, so we don't really mean that we're going to complete it by then, or do we? And but with that very simple challenge, somebody goes, oh no, I want it on the last Friday of the month. Already you've improved the clarity there. Already you're beginning to remove some of the ambiguity because you're being specific enough for somebody to go, I know what the date is, but it's also causing you to question in the communication itself, what date do we actually need it by and why? Your purpose piece, your relevance piece. If we need it by that particular date, why is that important? Why does it have to be that date and not another date? So it's causing us to have, and it's making use of a simple but powerful tool to go, how do I use this to communicate better?
Okay.
I think another one here is about feedback. I mean, we touched on feedback just a few minutes ago. Building strong feedback loops. And why is that important? Because we need to check for understanding. That's what feedback is for. Feedback is not for telling somebody off. Feedback is to go, here's some information. Let's check if you understand what the information is about and the context of it and why it's relevant to you and what is intended by the communication. Because if we've got a feedback loop, it means that the other person could go, well, what I've just heard is this. And you go, that's not what I thought I'd told you. So
A-
we've got that
a-
ability.
And of course, feedback is two-way, right?
Of
So it
course.
allows them to question, to challenge, to
Yes.
probe, to explore,
Hmm.
to test for understanding in terms of their context and their meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, what about emotions then, Rob? How are we going to counter some emotional responses?
Well, I think feedback helps with that tremendously. But I think a cornerstone to this is, again, a flaw in human nature. And that flaw is that typically we don't listen to understand. We tend to listen to respond or to defend or to justify. If you think about the typical conversations that you might have, I might have on a daily basis, where maybe we already are some knowledgeable about some of the aspect of that communication or the information that's being exchanged, we tend to tune out from somebody saying something to us because we're just waiting to respond rather than being patient and listening to understand, to get the full meaning, to see whether or not we are actually missing something, or actually to receive information that we go, yeah, completely agree with you. That's my understanding of it as well. So listening to understand, I think, is enormously powerful and underused.
Yeah, well, we our natural temptation is to jump in,
Yep.
to defend a position, to justify a perspective, and to come back with something. When actually, a lot of the time, particularly if you're receiving communication, it's not important. You will alleviate a lot of the assumptions by simply listening
Right.
and being present in that moment. So by listening, we mean actively
Yes.
listening
Yeah.
or attentively listening, depending on definition and terminology. But in the moment, you are focused on that recipient, or sorry, on the deliverer of the message,
Yes.
or on the medium in which you've received that message.
Yes. And your question about emotions, and I'm going to restate your example to you through a slightly different context that you used before, because in times of change, if you're attempting to listen to understand, a change announcement is being made to you, you then have an immediate emotional reaction, or you might have. You don't hear the rest of it. If there's a 25-minute or 40-minute announcement about a change, and within the first sentence you go, oh, hang on a second, what does that mean to me? And you go off on an emotional spiral. It doesn't matter if you were trying to listen to understand. The emotion has got in the way. So there are some things here that are watch outs for us, which probably brings us full circle back to the Forbes statistic that was stated right at the beginning. If 65% of communication is ineffective in the organization, there's probably no mystery, because there's so many things that get in the way of communication being good.
So what we're saying is, to counter some of these faux pas, if you like,
Hmm.
around communication, let's use the tools we've got.
Yes.
Use SMART as a way of getting specific, being really clear about, when and around what we mean by this in terms of potentially a measure,
Hmm.
and certainly focusing on that purpose, that relevance, why this is important and why now.
Absolutely.
Build these strong feedback loops, and making sure that when you're listening, it's to understand, not necessarily just to respond, defend, or even justify. Just understand it. It'll make life so much easier. Well, thanks, Rob. Let's close it there. What we're going to do next is we're going to look at the second part, which is how poor communication impacts the workplace. So we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Next time on The Question Is.
And think about, in this new kind of hybrid world, where we've got remote workers, they're going to feel more isolated. They're going to feel out of the loop, where, what am I missing out on by being at home? What am I not being told? What am I not seeing in terms of opportunities? Because presenteeism is one thing, but actually out of sight, out of mind is absolutely another. And that probably leads to people feeling a little bit isolated and excluded, even though that's not necessarily the intention.
To find out how Thinking Focus can unlock the potential within your organization, go to www.thinkingfocus.com, where you'll discover more about the work we do, helping our clients increase productivity and enable change.